All right, welcome everyone to this conversation today around saying goodbye to good enough identity security. So one of the things that we've noticed, I'll share my full screen here, in the broader identity market these days is there's a lot of good enough solutions out there. And we fundamentally believe that that's a function of just inertia, apathy, sometimes too much red tape within organizations. And today we're going to talk about why we have to say goodbye to some of the good enough identity security methods that are in the market today. And we're going to spend the bulk of our conversation today talking about the company and the technology that is in 50% of enterprises today, actually close to 100% of enterprises, but about 50% of their IT real estate, which is Microsoft and Windows Hello in particular. So let's jump into one of the most popular ways that companies are looking to go passwordless in 2026 and over the last couple of years in particular, which is Windows Hello for Business. And if you've had an opportunity to implement the technology, it can be really terrific, but there are some really big issues with it when the complexity of the real world actually kicks in. So if you're not familiar with Windows Hello for Business, it is the ability from Microsoft that allows you to utilize the biometric authentication that is on your laptop when you buy it from the store or when your company gives it to you to log into that laptop or any subsequent authentications necessary downstream, such as your single sign-on or whatever else. And it can be really, really cool. Like oftentimes it's a tremendous user experience, but we're going to talk about some of the pitfalls and some of the considerations that have to be made as you deploy this technology. And the reality is most enterprises right now, when they think about risk, the risk actually lies outside of the initial sign-in event. So how do organizations prevent that? And what are the user experience gotchas that we have to really understand, right? One of the things that we know working in identity and security, if there is a workaround for a security control, the end user will figure it out and they'll figure it out quickly. And then we're going to talk about some of the issues around adoption, behavior, cryptography concerns, and how hackers are exploiting these inconsistencies across Windows Hello for Business in particular. So first thing we'll discuss, and after the first 3 or 4 slides here, we're going to jump into a demo and then we're going to come back to the slides. So for those of you who are interested in that, be sure to stick around. But one of the things that we've seen, and we've talked to countless companies who have deployed Windows Hello for Business, is a significant amount of inconsistencies when it comes to the user experience in particular. And we're going to talk about some of the alternatives here that are really important to understand. So if you have a Windows computer that has face recognition, the reliability of that can vary depending on lighting, camera quality, accessories, right? Sometimes you plug your laptop into a monitor or a dock, right? And all of a sudden you don't have access to your fingerprint reader or your camera and you have to use a different camera. There's a lot of user experience issues around that in particular. And one of the things that Microsoft has done to try to remedy this painful user experience reality is Windows Hello offers a PIN as a fallback mechanism in order to log in. Now this PIN is what we call a decentralized PIN, meaning it only works on the laptop that you're on, has other pitfalls as well. But what we've seen is organizations making the PIN 121212 or writing it down on their keyboard, which kind of defeats much of the security purpose behind a biometric login or a passwordless login. 2 is when we look at Windows Hello for Business in particular, it doesn't tend to really match how many large enterprises work. Like, look, if you have a 20-person company and everybody has a Windows machine and they are only logging into their Windows machine to do their work, Windows Hello for Business is probably a really good solution, right? And can be a really good solution. However, when we look at anything at enterprise scale, there's oftentimes things like remote desktop access, necessity for multiple users to be able to log into the same computer, There's virtual desktop infrastructure, persistent, non-persistent endpoints. There's shared devices in conference rooms or kiosks, such as like frontline worker situations or in the finance industry. And there tends to be fleets of workstations that are mixed operating systems, right? So there's usually always a percentage of individuals in an organization that have MacBooks. And the identity and security team has to think about how do we provide a secure and consistent user experience. And what we oftentimes see with Windows Hello for Business deployments is exceptions get made with regards to fallback mechanisms in particular, and those tend to increase the amount of risk the organization has. So we'll jump into this later as well and talk about it in the demo. So speaking of the demo, we'll jump into it. So one of the things we're going to show here today is how we can securely onboard a user and then allow them to do their Windows login securely. And the goals of this demonstration and the goals of this technology is to be able to onboard an employee without ever giving them a password, which is really important, right? We want to be able to give an employee access to the systems without having to share a password to them over the phone or, God forbid, an email or snail mail or something like that. And we want to be able to enable them to access their laptop in a purely passwordless manner from day one of their employment. So let's jump into the demo here. So what you'll see here is on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the user's phone, and on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see their laptop. And this would be their corporate issued machine. If it's their first day on the job, they probably have never logged into this computer before. And so we're going to show how an employee, let's pretend that they are working from home and they're a remote employee and they just got their laptop in the mail and they need to access the corporate system. This is the process that they would undergo, in this case with HYPR. All right, so on their phone, on their first day of work, they will get an email address that says, click this link, and here's your corporate email. Welcome to the company, here's your email address. So what they'll do here is they'll get a text message that says, verify yourself. They'll click that link and they'll be told like, hey, you need to, in order to onboard you, we're going to need to verify your phone number, your location, and your government issued document, okay? And then we'll give you a credential into the enterprise. So they'll go through the HYPR verification process. This is what we call HYPR Affirm. They'll put in their email address that was sent to them to their personal email typically on their first day. In this case, it's a very long email address. So they'll put in their email address. They'll be asked to verify their phone number, right? So we'll verify their phone number and just over an SMS OTP. And we don't really depend on this SMS OTP for security. It's more in order to stop automated attacks against the system. We'll ask this individual to share their location, and then we will ask them to verify their government issued document. So in this case, they're going to be asked to validate their driver's license because they're in the United States. So they'll take a front and back picture of their driver's license, and then they'll be required to also take a selfie that will match the picture of the selfie with the picture of their driver's license. And once they do that, this incorporates liveness detection into it and incorporates several checks on the document itself. But once the employee is actually verified in this case, they will get an option to enroll their credentials. So remember, they're only doing this once, right, on their first day of work. So once they're verified, they'll get an option to enroll into HYPR. And this will essentially register a FIDO credential with the organization's Microsoft or Entra infrastructure. And then they'll be able to use that credential to access their work computer. So the employee was just registered. They'll be able to now open up their laptop. They'll scan a QR code on their laptop. And as soon as they scan that QR code, they're going to be authenticated into that endpoint. So this is how a business can ship a laptop to a brand new user, onboard them securely without having to ask them for some knowledge-based questions or give them a password over the phone or something similar, and then securely bootstrap a credential and then have them log into that computer without ever having to set up a password. So let's talk about why this is really important if we go back to the slides. So one of the things that we've identified just across working with hundreds of businesses is when you give users too many options, it tends to create confusion and not a lot of confidence. Users should always have options, but those options should be as limited in scope as possible to cover the broadest number of personas within your organization, right? So when you have multiple options to log into a computer, like a biometric, a PIN, a password fallback, this creates a lot of confusion. The one thing that creates a ton of confusion within organizations is when they have a Windows Hello PIN enabled and the password enabled at the same time. People don't know what to type into the field, and they get extremely confused and frustrated, and that results in calls to the IT service desk, and nobody's happy in that case. Users will always choose speed over security, especially during the authentication process. So any sort of fallback mechanisms that you have in place that might be faster but less secure will be used regularly, and that's going to be the weakest link in any sort of identity chain. Security teams with Windows Hello in particular also lose visibility into which factor is being used when authenticating a user. So if a user uses Windows Hello for Business and they log in using the RFID camera with biometrics, that is really secure usually, that's great. But if that user decides to use a PIN instead, the security team has no visibility into that, nor do they have the ability to actually enforce one or the other. Re-enrollment tends to be a really large pain point for organizations. This is especially critical during social engineering. So if a user calls up the help desk and says, hey, I can't log into my computer, what do I do? Typically the recovery mechanism with Windows Hello for Business is to give the user a password and say, here you go. Right? So this temporary access path really bypasses a lot of strong authentication controls, and this results in gaps within the organization's security posture overall, and it really increases the risk for the business. So it's really critical to make sure that the re-enrollment or credential recovery process is secure and it never results in a shared secret such as a password being shared over a phone or any other medium. So to give you a much broader picture of what most enterprises look like today and kind of how their risk posture actually looks like, let's look at the user's experience and the two primary points of access that they have when they go about their day. The first access point is the actual endpoint, right? So the workstation you're on, your laptop, that's Windows, Mac, or whatever else. And then the second point of access is the applications that you're logging into. That could be you accessing those applications either on your corporate laptop or on your BYOD device or your corporate issued mobile phone. It doesn't matter. These are the cloud-based apps like Office 365 and all the other stuff that we use on a daily basis. So if we look at the endpoint in particular, there's typically biometric options available now, right? Most modern laptops have a fingerprint reader or a face recognition camera. And so your primary authentication might be a Windows Hello or a Touch ID or something similar. But in 99% of situations, we see that the fallback authentication mechanism, if one of these biometric methods doesn't work, is a password. And this is where the risk is, because passwords are easy to phish and they're really expensive to manage. And then if the user types their password in wrong too many times, or maybe they forget it, or maybe they're locked out for whatever reason, then they have to go to the support desk for a credential reset. And the support desk typically uses knowledge-based questions to verify somebody's identity, right? So they're asking for their street they grew up on, their manager's name, or some other similar information. It's really a similar story for the other entry points into organizations, such as the applications, where you might be using a password in conjunction with a 2FA app, like a Microsoft Authenticator, right? Where you have to accept a push or verify a 6-digit code or something. These methods are easily phishable using modern phishing kits and are not phishing resistant by design. Oftentimes, if the user doesn't have the MFA app for whatever reason, organizations will still sometimes let them use an SMS OTP as a fallback. Luckily, that's going away more and more. And then if that doesn't work, they fall back to the support desk once again, right? Where they're being asked easy to answer questions in order to be issued a new credential. So that if you look at this diagram, everything on the right is vulnerable to social engineering attacks, right? Because AI and hackers can call up the help desk, pretend to be an employee, and get a credential. Everything in the middle is vulnerable to social engineering. So this is really one of those instances where when you look at the authentication methods that are available to users, you have to look at the weakest link that is available to the user, and that is essentially the highest level of assurance that you have. So let's look at this picture, but from a secure perspective. What does this look like when you actually turn off those authentication and credential reset methods that are insecure? So if you have an endpoint that has a biometric authenticator on it, like a Windows Hello or Touch ID, you should still be able to leverage that. It is a good user experience when it works, and oftentimes users will gravitate to that first as an initial attempt over typing a password or using an app. But your alternative authentication mechanism should always be phishing resistant. So this should be something like the HYPR app, which uses device-bound passkeys to authenticate the user to their endpoint, or something like a hardware token like a YubiKey or similar. And then if you need to reset your credential, you should never rely on a help desk to do a knowledge-based question quiz, because that is vulnerable to social engineering. Use something like HYPR to securely verify the identity of those individuals. And this is what you saw in the demo, where the user had to verify their phone, they had to verify their location, they had to verify their government-issued document, all in the same session in order to be issued a new credential. And a similar story applies to applications, right? And whether you're logging into Office 365, Workday, Salesforce, or any of these major apps, your authentication mechanism into that should always be phishing resistant. And so if you can't use a secure authenticator like the HYPR app, you should use a FIDO authenticator or a certificate-based authenticator like a YubiKey. And if you need to reset a credential for a user when they get a new phone or any other scenario, make sure you're utilizing a multi-factor verification process that ensures that that person is who they say they are before issuing them any new MFA code or a password or whatever else. Okay, I'm almost at time here. So this is the last bit here. But one thing I really want everybody to take away here today is mostly passwordless still means significant password risk, right? So passwords are typically still used as setup at most organizations, and the demo that we showed today really displays how you can get beyond that. Recovery is key, right? So anytime your help desk is used or knowledge-based questions are used to recover a credential, that is a massive risk to the organization. So making sure that multiple factors are utilized whenever bootstrapping a new credential is critical. One of the things that we didn't discuss too much, but it's really important, is remote access. So most organizations have to have some level of remote access available to their employees for things like troubleshooting or just general virtual desktop usage. Being able to have the ability to ensure and enforce a passwordless login that doesn't fall back to a weak credential across all these shared workstations or virtual desktops is critical. And this is where things like Windows Hello for Business just don't work, because they're meant for dedicated workstations. And then the last one is the device replacement piece. When your users get a new device, whether it's a phone or a laptop, how do you make sure that re-enrollment never relies on a shared secret, and that you're never falling back or making exceptions to go back to a password, even for a limited amount of time? All right, so that's it. That's all I wanted to cover today. Thank you. I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, reach out to us, and have a wonderful day.